This is John for MTG Nexus coming at you with the top 5 modern deck lists, or top 5 modern decks for the beginning of September of 2022. As a friendly reminder, if you do like this kind of modern content, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, leaving a constructive comment down below. So to start out, the modern format hasn't really changed a whole lot so far from the beginning of Dominaria United. Not that many expected there to be a bunch of very powerful cards for the modern format. This is not Modern Horizons 2. This is not Throne of Eldraine. The format wasn't going to get shooken up a whole lot. Now, there are some cards that might pop up here and there, but most of what most people were excited about Dominaria United for the Eternal formats was really some reprints, things like Liliana of the Veil, the Painlands, etc. Now, there are some cards people are trying, but they're really role players in Tier 2 and Tier 3 decks. So, that said, the list isn't going to change a whole lot, but there is going to be one important shift that we're going to talk about probably at deck number 5. Start out with the deck that's kind of been crowned as the best deck in the format, or at least the most played deck in the format, and that is Blue-Red Murktide. Not really a whole lot to say about it since the printing of Ledger Shredder. Most people have been, well, whether you play Ledger Shredder, whether you play Dragon Rage's Channeler, a lot of lists have kind of settled on you play both, and you just, play 3 Ledger Shredder, play 3 Murktide, play 4 DRC, play 4 Ragavan, and just play all the good, efficient blue-red spells. Expressive Iteration is still a heck of a card. Archmage's Charm is still a heck of a card. Unholy Heat is very good when you're playing Mishra's Bauble. Mishra's Bauble is a free cantrip. What more can you say? You get to play Blood Moon, you get to play a bunch of very powerful blue and red spells, and you basically get to play Delver Light in Modern, a deck that's gotten how many cards banned out of it in Legacy. There is one deck that really competes with it fairly well, and that obviously being 4-color control that we'll get to in a minute. But, this is probably the best pound-for-pound deck in the format, and, as more people pick it up, the deck's numbers are just going to continue to rise, and there isn't really a whole lot of things you can do to stop it. The next thing is 4-color Omanth control, whether you want to play the Elementals version or you play the Counterspell Expressive Iteration version. The deck is really the same as far as a lot of what it's doing, whether you're able to interact on the stack a little bit, or whether you have Risen Reef and Elamari's Call a little bit more and you're trying to just outvalue your opponent. Either which way, you have a bunch of 2-for-1s in your deck, you're trying to outgrind the opponent. And, this is arguably the most powerful deck in the format in terms of just pure card quality. Has a reasonable Murktide matchup. You can kind of argue from both sides. I would say that the later the game goes, the more it favors 4-color control. The shorter the game is, the more it tends to favor Murktide. But, this is a deck that can just outvalue almost every deck in the format other than, decks like Scapeshift and Tron. Beyond that, it can even outgrind blue-white control. So, it's just a very powerful mid-range slash control deck that just plays a bunch of the broken cards, plays, all your Modern Horizons 2 specials. You play 4-color, you play Omanth Lotus Creation, you play Teferi, you play Renin Ticks. You just get to play all the broken stuff and grind your opponent out. And if you learn how to win with the deck quickly, it might be even a slightly better deck than Murktide, but Murktide happens to be a little bit more represented because maybe it's a little bit cheaper and a little bit quicker to win games, so you're maybe more likely to close out games without having to play 45 minutes each particular round. Hammer Time, probably the best aggressive slash combo deck in the format. Kind of pains me to say that as a burn player, but generally this is the best aggressive deck in the format. It combines the powerful things that you need in your aggressive decks in the format. A win out of nowhere combo. You have resilient creatures that and you can disrupt your opponent. All of that's kind of important in the current meta, with Solitudes and Furies and all these other different things going on. You have the great plan A of Colossus Hammer plus either Sigarda's Aid or Pure Steel Paladin. You have so many different ways to retrieve it, and then you have the great backup plans of things like Urza's Saga, getting Stoneforge Mystic for Caldera complete. You have all these different angles of attack, and this deck really hasn't lost much of a beat since playing Lurrus, and may actually have gotten slightly better in terms of, playing a little bit better equipment, like Caldera Complete, Nettle Assist, whatever other particular 3-mana equipment it might play, Sword of Fire and Ice, etc. You get to play this mainly mono-white base. Sometimes they splash blue for things like Reality Chip, Light Permission on the sideboard, Lavinia, whatever you're trying to splash. Sometimes there's a light Blight splash for things like Thoughtseize and Dark Confidant. And you have all these different things going on with the deck, but the core of the deck is still the hammers, plus the Urza's Sagas make it a very powerful deck, and it does have some rough matchups. Amulet can be a little bit of a rough matchup, 4-color control can be a bit of a rough matchup, but still the kill you out of nowhere combo, much like Heroic out of the Pioneer formats. This is a deck, or even a deck like Infect out of Legacy. It's a deck you have to respect, and is a very powerful combo aggressive deck. Makes it the number 3 best deck in the format currently. Number 4 is Living End. It's probably distanced itself enough as the best Cascade deck, so you could argue whether this or Rhinos deserve to be in the number 4 spot, but this is a deck that can consistently win on turn 4. It can disrupt a lot of what's going on with the opponent's stuff, with either things like Force of Negation and Subtlety. It also gets to play Grief to disrupt the opponent, and then just has this Living End Cascade combo that just gets put like 16 or 20 power in play, win over a turn or two, and the disruption usually has done its job. It plays enough good Living End pilots will know what to do as far as sideboarding in against Graveyard Hate, how you're going to fight, what to expect out of what decks. If you're playing against Murktide, you're not going to be seeing a lot of Graveyard Hate, but you might see like some Soul Guide Lanterns, you might see Tormod's Crypts. If you're playing 4-color control, you can expect a bunch of Endurances. Just learning how to play that, really navigating it. It's one of the easier decks to learn to pilot, especially game 1, and then just learning to fight around the hate makes it a very powerful deck with the Cascade elements plus the discard and the counter spells. And overall, this deck is very fun to play. And if you like to play this style of deck in small bursts, it's a nice combo deck. It also is able to wrath away opposing creature decks, like Living End or Hammer Time and such. Getting them with a Violent Outburst at instant speed, putting a bunch of power into player on your own side of the board can be quite backbreaking. And overall, this deck has kind of differentiated itself as one of the core top 4 decks in the modern format. Finally, this deck is kind of arbitrarily number 5, and that is Boros Burn. Now, Boros Burn is a little bit overrepresented right now on MTG Goldfish, hence why it's kind of on this list, because it has a large population in the paper events, because a lot of people will pop up for one of modern event, like the one that was held in Columbus this past weekend, and play Burn because they don't have access to all of the cards, and it happens to be a fairly cheap deck that has a very low learning curve at the very beginning. So it's a deck you can pick up and play at your one of modern event if you happen to be like, say, a legacy grinder or a standard player or someone who plays Pioneer. It's a deck you can pick up, do well. It doesn't going to break the bank, or maybe your friend used to play Burn, now they picked up, say, 4-color control. So it's a deck that tends to be overrepresented in the paper meta, so therefore it has a little bit better results than some of the other things like Amulet Titan, Golgari Yawgmoth, some of the other decks that have kind of sold themselves into the tier right below the top 4, Rhinos, those kind of decks. So, while I'm not going to say that this is the 5th best deck overall, it is the deck that has done the most recently of that like secondary tier beyond Yawgmoth, within the same branch as Yawgmoth, Amulet Titan, etc. It's a deck that you can do well with. It has some rough matchups among the top 4. It has some very good matchups among the top 4. We'll actually kind of cover a matchup matrix from last month to give you some idea of like where the matchups kind of fall. Just have a better idea of where the meta is kind of bouncing around. But Boros Burn is the number 5 list for right now because it had a very big showing this weekend in Columbus. Just a large number of people showing up to play this particular deck. So this is a quick spreadsheet. Now this is a little bit outdated. This goes through the end of August, so this isn't going to have the recent data from Dominaria United in play, but just kind of gives you an idea of how the meta is overall, especially among the top decks where there's enough examples of it to show you kind of where the matchups are. Murktide, obviously, most played deck in the format. I've been saying for a while that I think Burn actually has a bad matchup against Murktide, or it wasn't that great, and these kind of numbers kind of showing this out. Now, granted, the sample sizes here, not that great, not always representative of what the matchups are, but it does show that, Burn has a little bit of a rough matchup against Murktide. 4-color control, probably the deck that most people consider the best against Murktide. Living in kind of a 50-50 thing here with 84 matchups. Hammer Time seems like it's a bit of a rough matchup for Murktide. Then Amulet Titan is a little bit close. Obviously, Blood Moon counterspells tends to be very good. And then, 4-color Elementals, another Omnath 4-color pile that gives Murktide a bit of a fit. Burn, the second most played deck, once again, as we've kind of covered, it does tend to be a little bit overrepresented because it's a little bit cheaper than some of the other top decks, but still a fairly reasonable deck. You have a decent 4-color control deck, you have a decent matchup against 4-color Elementals, decent matchup against Yawgmoth, but, you tend to struggle here against Murktide, and you tend to struggle against Hammer Time. Hammer Time's a little bit close, but I do think Hammer Time is favored, and I do think Living End, the way, especially with the Leyline of Sanctity versions, and the way they've started with the subtleties to really attack Eidolons and stuff, I do think that has become a bit of a rough matchup for Burn. 4-color Control, we've already talked about possibly being the best deck in the meta, has a good Murktide matchup, okay against Burn, pretty good against Living End, which surprises a lot of people, but it's one of those decks that once I think people have figured out how to play against Living End with this deck, that it has a good matchup. Hammer Time's a close matchup. Amulet, once again, an over-the-top combo deck. Not really surprising that it's good against the mid-range deck. Living End, pretty good numbers. Decent against Murktide. Pretty good against Burn. Weak against 4-color, although I would say that's probably closer to a 50-50 matchup. Good matchup against Hammer Time. Hence why I'm saying this is, but tends to struggle against a lot of the other random decks like Amulet, tends to struggle against Golgari, tends to struggle against Shadow, Blue-Eye Control, and it actually has among the worst percentages against the other pile than some of these other top decks. And then Hammer Time, obviously, good Murktide matchup, good, solid matchup, Burn matchup, solid matchup against 4-color Control, not great against Living End, not great against Amulet, and then kind of gets dumpstered by Elementals. And then finally, Amulet, another deck you can argue is among the best win percentages besides Hammer Time. Close matchup against Murktide, dumpsters Burn, has a good 4-color Control matchup, has a good Living End matchup, has an okay Hammer Time matchup. Once again, as you get into these lesser and lesser numbers, it's a little bit harder to kind of, get a good read on the format, but overall you kind of get the idea of like where the matchup matrices. Now obviously this just kind of gives you some idea if you don't play these decks personally or don't have a ton of experience with the decks. Kind of gives you a broad swath of data as far as kind of how the matchups shape up overall. Want to do something a little bit different for this month because let's be honest, the top 6 or 7 decks of Modern haven't changed much, and where you put them is kind of arbitrary. Once you get beyond Murktide and 4-color Omnath piles, those are the 2 best decks, and then everything else just kind of shuffles around, with 3 and 4 obviously kind of being Hammer and Living End, and then 5th through probably 9 arbitrary, whether you want to throw Golgari in there or Golgari in there, whether you want to throw Elementals in there, whether you want to throw Rhinos in there, Amulet, Burn, etc. That 5th slot's kind of arbitrary. But this does give you some idea of where the format lines up, and, gives you a decent matrices. And this was by MTG Data on Twitter. Their user handle is MTG_data. So if you like that kind of data, they do quite a bit. Not as often as they used to, but, they still put out some good tweets. This is actually the last tweet they put out, but, this gives you some idea of how the format's been shaping up. And hopefully this is a little bit more information for you. And if you want to check that out, I'll try to include the link in the description of the video. And as always, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and let me know how you like this kind of Modern content.